We're joined now by Arkansas Republican Senator Tom Cotton, member of the Armed Services Committee. Great to have you back on Fox News Sunday.
Thank you, Shannon. Good to be back with you.
Let's start with this pause because there are folks who don't think it's been the best idea. Wall Street Journal, an opinion piece over there says, a ceasefire deprives Israel of military momentum and transfers the initiative to Hamas. Now that Israel has agreed to a short ceasefire, the Biden administration and its Qatari interlocutors will expect longer ceasefires. Hamas will remain armed and dangerous in Gaza and will use this ceasefire to regroup. But we have gotten dozens of hostages out. What do you make of it? Where do we go from here?
Well, I don't want to second guess the Israeli government. They had near unanimous support across many different political parties and in their senior security leadership that this was the appropriate step to take. So I'm not going to second guess the Israeli government. But I have to say, it seems like President Biden puts more pressure on Israel than he does on Hamas and its hosts in Qatar. Part of the reasons why we got to this point where we had to have a 4-day pause is the Biden administration has consistently behind the scenes insisted that Israel's government take steps that are clearly not in Israel's interest. For instance, providing fuel into Gaza, not just water or food or medicine, but fuel, which may as well be providing them with ammunition. I'm also very frustrated that we have not seen the release of a single American hostage. Perhaps there'll be one today, but apparently Hamas is so contemptuous of President Biden and American power that they feel the imperative to release Filipinos and Thai hostages before they release American hostages. That's just one small example of the weakness that President Biden has projected around the world that has resulted in things like Americans being taken hostage or Iran attacking Americans more than 70 times now since or over the last month or the fall of Kabul in 2021.
So to the point about Americans still being held there, Democratic Congressman Dean Phillips, by the way, mounting a run against President Biden in the primary lane with Democrats. He says he thinks we should be using U.S. forces on the ground potentially to get those Americans out. Here's what he says.
By now, I would have expected American special forces to perhaps play a hand in extracting them. I think it's absurd, shocking, and dismaying that 6 weeks later we still have American hostages held by a terror organization in Gaza. I'm happy for the Israelis, don't get me wrong. Hamas should release all hostages. But the fact that we have Americans sitting in Gaza right now held hostage is appalling and should be addressed immediately.
You have served in uniform overseas. What do you make about this call for using U.S. Special Forces to get our folks out?
Well, we should certainly be open to that. I mean, we have elite special operations forces who are specifically trained in hostage rescue. I do think we have to be deferential to the Israeli government and the Israeli Defense Forces about the tactical situation on the ground. But if American military forces are called upon and can provide a viable solution to get out American citizens and the citizens of Israel or other nations, then we have to be open to that. But again, it's not just those small special operations units that we have trained. We have 2 aircraft carriers in the region. We've increased the number of troops and aircraft we have in the region. Yet Hamas is still so contemptuous of President Biden that it hasn't yet released American hostages. This would have never happened under Donald Trump or Ronald Reagan. In fact, if you recall, Jimmy Carter had a hostage crisis with Iran, Hamas's patron, for over 400 days. Iran released those hostages the day Ronald Reagan took office because they were so scared of what Ronald Reagan might do to them. You don't see that kind of fear of President Biden from Hamas or Iran or frankly anyone around the world.
But you talk about our assets in the region. We talk about our troops in uniform in the region. How worried are you about that expanding into something broader that we get drawn into? Because I don't think the American people have a taste for that.
Well, unfortunately, Shannon, it's already expanded. Since Joe Biden took office, Iran has attacked American positions in the Middle East, I think now over 150 times. And just in the last month, it's over 70 times. We've only hit back a few times. When we do hit back, it's almost always at empty proxy warehouses or maybe proxy forces in Iraq and Syria. It seems like the president wants to go out of his way to avoid Iranian casualties.
But what targets would you suggest?
I would target Iranians who are operating in Iraq and in Syria. I would also send a clear message to Iran: if these attacks don't stop immediately, then we'll begin to threaten their assets, like Ronald Reagan when he sank half of Iran's Navy for attacking a U.S. Navy ship. Look, the president keeps talking about fear of escalation. Fear of escalation ensures escalation. The way to stop it is to establish escalation dominance over a terror-supporting regime like Iran. You know, Sean Connery's character, Jim Malone in The Untouchables, said to Kevin Costner's character, Elliot Ness, about how to handle the Chicago mob: if they send one of yours to the hospital, you send one of theirs to the morgue. That's not just the Chicago way, that's the way of the Middle East, and President Biden doesn't appear to understand that.
But do we get drawn into something akin to World War III? Is that what Hamas wanted all along? I mean, clearly they didn't want Israel to achieve some of these peace talks that they were having, that the U.S. was involved in as well. But to, get militarily involved, kinetically involved with their landmass is a different situation. That's another level.
No, Shannon, like what Ronald Reagan did when he sank half of Iran's navy, it didn't lead to an open, outright war. In fact, it ended the Iran-Iraq war, which had been waging for more than 8 years because Iran was so scared of Ronald Reagan. After Donald Trump directed the killing of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq, Iran's terrorist mastermind, Iran pulled in its horns for the rest of the Trump era. The way to stop these attacks is not to be fearful and hesitant and cautious in a response, but massive retaliation to make it clear we will not tolerate these attacks on Americans. Otherwise, I fear we're going to see a mass casualty attack against American forces in the region.
Well, you know that there is a strong sentiment in that region that is blaming the U.S. as well, pointing fingers at us. Washington Post says this: political analysts in the Middle East called Washington's support for Israel's war a reckless position that doesn't account for the long-term diplomatic, security, and economic effects of alienating a region where rivals, namely China, which you and I have talked about many times, are carving deeper inroads. More importantly, they said the war has toppled the United States from its moral high ground. So do you worry about the longer-term impacts of alienating many in the Arab world, especially the younger generation who clearly does not think the U.S. is on the right side of this conflict?
Life in the Middle East is not a church picnic. What you need more than anything is iron will and crushing force. And what I fear most threatens American interest and stability in the region is American weakness. Arab leaders want to be partners with a strong America and, frankly, with a strong Israel, because the thing they fear most is Iran and its terror proxies, like its paramilitary groups in Iraq and Syria, or Hamas or Hezbollah, or the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which President Biden took off the terrorist list in his early days in office. That kind of weakness and the weakness we've seen towards Iran is what's going to imperil American interest and lives in the region, not being hesitant or cautious or showing restraint in the face of attacks on American troops and citizens in the region and this massacre of Israelis on October 7th.
You got a lot ahead of you as you come back from this break. Funding fights over Ukraine, Israel, the border, all of that. What are your hopes that comes together?
Well, for the last 2 years, President Biden has showed that he seems to care more about Ukraine's borders than he cares about America's borders. We Republicans care about both. We want to secure our border. We want to stop the flow of illegal immigrants in this country and the crime and the drugs and the potential terrorism it could open this country up to. At the same time, we want to help Ukraine resist Russia's war of unprovoked aggression. So in return for providing additional funding for Ukraine, we have to have significant and substantial reforms to our border policy, specifically asylum and parole, the processes that are being abused at our border for millions of illegal migrants to come in this country over the last 3 years.
We'll talk to our next guest, too, to see if he thinks you guys can make any bipartisan progress on that. Senator, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
I'm Steve Duke.